B'Shem Hashem Na'aseh v'Natzliach. We begin Masechet Megilah, Daf Bet. The Masechet deals not only with Purim. We're going to have a long section of interpretation of Megillat Esther, which is beautiful because we don't generally have Bavli Midrash on any book, but it's here. It's included right here in this Masechet. Where also we'll see a lot of the laws of Bet Knesset and Kiryat Sefer Torah. So a lot of relevant and a lot of interesting topics. So we begin with the reading of the Megillah itself, one of the mitzvot of the holiday. Megillah nikret ba'achad asar, b'shnem asar, b'shlosha asar, ba'arba'a asar, b'chamisha asar, lo pachot ve'lo yoter. And we start with Megillah nikret. It doesn't say korinat Megillah, but in a passive verb. And perhaps that's because Megillah is not a mitzvah for every single person to read it for themselves, unlike Kiryat Shema, but rather you could either read it yourself or hear someone else read it for you. And maybe that explains this language. And here we have something very strange and really unique among any other holiday, that you can perform this mitzvah. This mitzvah is performed on a number of days, on one of 5 different days, not before the 11th and not after the 15th, but depending on who and where you are, you will read it on the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, or 15th. When do we ever find any other holiday that you have such a thing? I know we have Yom Tov Sheni, that's true, but that's different just because we didn't know what the right day was. You have Pesach Sheni. All right, that's also a little different. That's because they couldn't do the main one, so this is a kind of makeup. But where else would we have something that is a holiday that's celebrated on various days? So to try to explain this, we should note that this is only referring to the reading of the Megillah, not the celebration of the day, which would be only on the 14th or 15th. And the 14th or 15th is because of those are said explicitly in Megillah. And Megillat Esther. So it's not talking about the celebration of the day, rather just the reading of the Megillah. And there's a number of sources, we're going to see one today, that says that the reading of the Megillah isn't the actual celebration, but rather a preparation. A few days, sometime either that day or sometime before, read the Megillah so that you'll know what this whole day is about, and then you'll be prepared to read it. So therefore, we choose a convenient day for reading it, if the most convenient is not the day itself. All right, so I think that is a helpful explanation. And now let's explain each of these dates. Kerachin hamukafin choma mimot Yehoshua bin Nun b'chamisha asar, kefarim v'ayarot gedolot korin b'arba'a asar, ela shekefarim aktivim leyom kenisa. So any city that has a wall from the time of Yehoshua bin Nun will read on the 15th. Now this is also needs some explanation. Why do we care if it has a wall from the time of Yehoshua bin Nun? If you look at Megillat Esther, it only says that Shushan had an extra day of fighting on the 14th, and therefore they stopped fighting and rested and celebrated on the 15th. So it makes sense that in every year afterwards, if you're in Shushan, celebrate on the 15th. Everywhere else would be on the 14th. If you just had Megillat Esther, that's what you would think. So why are we now coming and including more other cities that have a wall? So the answer to this, that Talmud Yerushalmi explains best, is that we don't want to have a special celebration in Shushan and not in the main cities of Eretz Israel, like Yerushalayim, which had a wall back then, and or other cities, other big cities in Yerushalayim. We don't want Shushan to be more important than the cities of Israel. And therefore, we include and say, just like Shushan has a special day of celebration, so too we will include in that special day any walled city in Israel. And the fact that it's from the time of Yehoshua bin Nun and not from the time of Ahashverosh, we're going to see another opinion today, that some say it is in fact from the time of Ahashverosh, but perhaps this is particularly to include Jerusalem, which presumably did have a wall, and Yehoshua conquered the city. You can look in Yehoshua chapter 10 and chapter 12, verse 10, and you'll see that Yehoshua conquered the king of Yerushalayim, and assuming it did have a wall, so there you go. So Yerushalayim will have the same status as Shushan. If you look up the word Bira, there's only two cities in the whole Tanakh that are called Habira, the capital, and that's Shushan Habira and Yerushalayim Habira. So it does make sense to connect them. That might be part of an implicit message of the Megillat Esther. What are you doing, Jews, and celebrating in Shushan Habira with the king rather than in Yerushalayim Habira with the King of Kings? Okay, so that seems to be what this law is doing. We're including within Shushan, we are including all the cities of Israel from the time they have a wall, major cities, and we want to make sure it's from Yoshua bin Nun. All right, now Kifarim va'ayarot gedolot, small villages and large cities that don't have a wall, they read on the 14th. That's the standard day. However, the small villages will, if they need to, advance to the day of assembly. The day of assembly, most people say, means that in the villages they didn't have anyone that knew how to read. So they used to come into the bigger city on Mondays and Thursdays, either because that's when the courts meet, or to read Torah, or that's when the market day was. And so we don't bother them to have to come in more than that. So when they come in on Monday and Thursday, then someone in the large city will read for them, which leads to an interesting problem of how could someone in the large city who is obligated on the 14th read for someone else on the 13th or 12th or 11th, when he himself is not obligated to read on that day. To answer that, I think there's a simpler explanation of the Mishnah, which is that Yom HaKinisa doesn't necessarily mean the day that the villagers go to the big city. It can mean the day when the villagers gather in the village. Most days, the villagers are farmers, and they go out early in the morning, at sunrise, out to their farms, and they don't have time to get together, except on Monday and Thursday, where there is special Torah reading. And then since they are getting together on those days, they do have someone to read, and they will read. This also explains another problem of reading Megilah the night before, right? Even if they're coming to the bigger city during the day, what about the night before? How are they going to read that? If they're reading in their local village, but they're able to get together, that would make more sense. Okay, and the Gemara will give also a further explanation of this. Now, Kesad, now we're going to go through all the permutations to see when will Megilah be read on the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, or 15th. Kesad, Chaliot Arba'asar Basheni. We start off with a simple case where the 14th of Adar is on Monday. Kefirim v'ayarot gedolot korin bo bayom. So the big cities and the small villages will read on that day. That's the 14th. And it's a Yom HaKinisa Monday. Mukafot levchoma lemachad, and those that have a wall will read the next day, which is the 15th. There you go, 14 and 15. Chaliyot b'shlishio b'rbi'i. If Purim falls out on Tuesday or Wednesday, then kifirim makdimim liyom HaKinisa. The small villages will go back to the Monday, which will be either the 12th or the 13th. The large cities on that day, and those with the wall the next day of the 15th. So far we have now the 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15. We don't have a case of 11 yet. If the 14th of Adar is on Thursday, that's also an easy case. Or everyone reads on that very day, Thursday, except the walled cities will be the next day. Chaliot Erev Shabbat, if the 14th is on Friday, Kefarim Makdimim Liyom HaKenisa, Vayarot Gedolot Mukafot Choma Korin Bo Bayom. Then the small villages will go back to the Thursday, which is just the day before. That's the 13th, and the large cities will read at that day, and the walled cities will also read that day, the 14th. That's interesting, even though really they should read on the 15th, but the 15th is on Shabbat, and we never read Megilah on Shabbat, and so therefore, rather than go to the next day, which they can't do because then that'll be the 17th, and you're never allowed to read on the 17th. So then the walled cities read on the same day, on the 14th. Chaliot ba Shabbat, if Purim is on Shabbat itself, then the large city, the villages and the large cities go back to Yom HaKenisa. That's also interesting because we don't read on Shabbat at all. So for sure, the small villages are going to go back to Thursday. But here, even the large cities, technically they could read on Friday. But once you're moving it anyway, you may as well move it to a Thursday, which is a more convenient day. And those walled cities will read Sunday, which is the 16th. That's fine. And here the last case is if the 14th is on Sunday, then Kefarim, the small villages, Makdimim Yom HaKenisa, have to go all the way back from Sunday all the way back to Thursday, and that would be the 11th. So this is the only case when anyone would read on the 11th of Adar. The big cities on that day, Mukafot Choma, the Machar, and those that are walled city would be on the next day, which is the 15th. And there you go. Now we have all of the cases. All right, the Gemara is going to now find a source for this. What we're going to do first is a derivation of where do we derive that we can read on many different days. We're going to look for a source. We're going to find two opinions. One is from the word Zemanehim, and another one, the second opinion is that it's from the words like the days, Kayamim. So let's see how this works. Megilah nikret ba'achad asar minelan. Okay, now the answer is going to be down here in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. But this is now a later layer asking a question on the question, Minelan. We're going to give a source just soon, in a little while, in the Gemara itself. So you see, this is a later Gemara, wondering why, this chronologically later, wondering why we're asking this, since textually we already asked this question. And over there, later on in the Gemara, we're going to say, that the sages were lenient on the small villages, that they should be able to read in the gathering day, so that on the 14th itself, they will be available to provide water and food to their brethren in the large cities. You need someone to be bringing all the food for all the parties that they're doing. So if it happens to be that the day, the gathering day is the 14th is the gathering day, then yeah, they'll read it together. But if not, they could take advantage of the opportunity to be the ones to bring all the food and water to the people in the village who rely on the farmers, the people in the city who rely on the people in the village. Okay, so minalan, we already gave an answer of why. So the word minalan could mean from where, what's the biblical source for it, but it could also mean what's the logical, reasonable source for it. So we already gave an explanation of why this should be. Why are you asking this again here? And here's our answer to why we're asking it again. Anan hachika amrinan. Here's what I meant to say when I asked. We know that all the days, the whole Purim was established by Anshe Knesset Gedolah, and this makes Purim unique. It's one of the few days that are not in the Torah, and yet it was established as a holiday. And so you need a lot of authority to do that. So we know that it was the Anshe Knesset Gedolah refers to the council of sages that was around during the Persian period and later during the second Bet HaMikdash period. We don't have a lot of sources about them. There's very few, but someone had to be in the leadership. So this is who they are. Our question is, if assuming that the masters of the Great Assembly, they established the 14th and the 15th, and only that's it. And now, can later rabbis have the authority to uproot what they established and now add more days? They can't do that. After all, in Masechet Eduyot, Mishnah teaches אין בית דין יכול לבטל דברי בית דין חברו, אלא אם כן גדול ממנו בחוכמה ובמניין. A future beit din cannot cancel something that a previous beit din did unless it is greater in wisdom and in number, which is pretty much impossible. So that means that if the earlier court said only the 14th and the 15th, then the later court can no longer say, oh, add also 11, 12, and 13. So, rather, it must be that all these 5 days were already established by the men of the great assembly. And now our question is, Minilan, how do we know this from a pasuk in the Tanakh? So we know the reason already. The reason was already said in a Gemara that we're going to see soon. But now we want to know the source from the Tanakh. Okay, good. So now we finally know what our question is. We can appreciate the answer. And here's answer number 1. Amar Rav Shemen bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Kera. לקיים את ימי הפורים האלה בזמניהם. זמנים הרבה תיקנו להם. Okay, the full pasuk is part of a letter that Queen Esther is sending to all the Jewish communities and says, לקיים את ימי הפורים האלה בזמניהם. You should observe this holiday, these days of Purim. So it's already calling them plural days of Purim, and then adds this extra word bizmanehem, in their times. So it doesn't just say bizmano at the right time, but in plural, and that implies that there are many proper times for the observance of this day. Okay, so that's the proof. That's how we know that already from the men of the Great Assembly, including Mordechai and those who were there at the time, those who established this very day, already put in the verse that there are multiple available days to read the Megilah. Good. Question. Wait a second. We need this word to teach us it itself. After all, you have to know that you have to observe Purim at its time. So I need to know, right? I need to know it's at its time. Says, you're right. I do need a word, but it could have just said Zeman, to observe it at its time. Why is it plural? Their times. That's not sufficient. No, I still want to have a plural because I have the 14th and the 15th, right? And though we know in the Megilah itself, those are 2 different days. And some are going to celebrate on the 15th, some on the 14th, some on the 15th, and these are 2 different days. So I need the word just for that. And the answer to that is Imken lema kera zemanam mai zemanehem shmat mina kulehu. I could have made the word plural by just saying zemanam, their time, and then I already had the right plural that there is a time for these people and for those people. It's already giving at one time for different people. Different people have different times. So it's already I could learn 2 days from that. From the fact that it adds not only that its time, their time, but their times, Zemanehim, that means I learn even more than that, and there has to be more than 2 days. Okay, now, Ema Zemanim Tuva. Well, if so, maybe there's even more than these 5 days. Maybe I could add the whole month. Zemanehim dumya dizmanam. Zemanam today of Zemanehim today. Says no, I can't do that because I have the word at the root of this word is zemanam, their times, and that refers to the 14th and 15th. That's 2 dates. So when I make that word plural, I could only double it and add another 2 dates. That's even though you're making something plural, doesn't mean infinity, right? It means the minimum of plural, which is 2. So I already know 2. So this is doubling it to 4. Now, well, since it's only 4, maybe it'll be the 12th and 13th, right? The basic text says 14 and 15, and this will add 2 more days, 12 and 13. How do I know 11? כדאמר רב שמואל בר יצחק 13 זמן קהילה לכל היא ולא צריך לריבויה. Because the 13th is already a day of assembly. The 13th is the day on which they got together and they were fighting the war. That was a major event. So therefore, the 13th doesn't have to be added. Certainly, one could observe and read Megillah on the 13th. You don't need an extra word for that. So therefore, he said that in a different context, so we're going to apply it here also. Therefore, it does not require an extra word. Nowadays, the 13th is Megillah, is Ta'anit Esther. However, Ta'anit Esther is not mentioned anywhere in the Talmud. It's mentioned only for the first time in the Baraita of R in the She'iltot, who actually does mention it in this context. The people gather to fast, to the fast of Esther. But in the original Gemara, this must be referring to a time of gathering. It was Yom Nikanor, if you remember, also, but probably referring to a time of gathering at the time of that war. Now, okay, fine. I agree with you. We have to add 2 more days, and the 13th is already implicit. So I have 13, 14, and 15. But I could go the other way and add the 16th and 17th of Adar. And then I would go past that, and that would account for, the villagers on their day. Just go forward. No, there's another pasuk that says, Velo ya'avor ketib. This pasuk says, "Kimu v'kiblo Yehudim." The Jews accepted upon themselves. Now, in the Peshat, "V'lo ya'avor" means that they will not take it back. They will not violate this day. But avod also can mean to pass over, and they won't pass by this day, which means the 15th is the latest. And no one is allowed to read Megillah after that day. So therefore, have to add from before it. All right, good. So all that was proof. Source number 1. How do we know that there are many days? From the word Zemanehim, and we saw in various ways it has to refer to 11, 12, and 13, besides 14 and 15. Okay, now we're going to see a second opinion. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani Amar Kera Kayamim Asher Nachu Bahem HaYehudim Yamim Kayamim Lerabot Ahad Asar Ushnem Asar. So the full pasuk says that the Kayam Alehem Liot Osim Et Yom Arba Asar LeChodesh Adar Ve'et Yom Chamisha Asar Bo Bechol Shana V'Shana. They accepted upon themselves that just like the first year they celebrated on the 14th and then others on the 15th, so too Kayamim. So they accepted upon themselves, like those days that the Jews rested from their enemies, in future years, they also will accept these days. So that's the Peshat, what Kayamim means, like the 14th and 15th of year 1, so too they will do on year 2 and 3. However, the Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani is understanding it differently. Kayamim means just like we celebrate on the 14th and 15th, there's 2 other days on which we also celebrate. Kayamim, it comes to include 2 more days of the 11th and the 12th. And then we go through the same exercise. Maybe say the 12th and 13th. No, the 13th, everybody's already gathering. And so you don't need, that's already a special day. And therefore you don't need an extra pasuk. You see, this is probably where the original context of Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak, and we re-quote it in the discussion right before the Yochanan. Now, why don't you say the 16th and 17th? No, the word v'lo ya'avod means don't pass the 15th. That's the last day. Good. Now, let's compare these two. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, how come the second opinion doesn't say like the first and learn it from their times? Answer is Zemanam, Zemanehim, Lamashma le. He doesn't agree that you can take one word and split it into 3 levels. That the basic word teaches you that you have to read Megilah, and then Zemanam teaches you 14 and 15, and Zemanehim comes and adds 11 and 12. No, you can't add so many layers just to one word, right? The word can only teach you one thing. Rav Shemen bar Abba, Amar mi Kayamim. And Rav Shemen bar Abba, the first opinion, who said name of Yochanan, how come he doesn't like Kayamim? Because he reads it as according to the Peshat. The Peshat is that in future generations, you will celebrate these very same days, the 14th and the 15th, just like in the first year. Good. So they both have good reason to disagree with each other. All right. Fantastic. And now we get to a Baraita of Rabbi Yehuda, although we'll see who is the real author. We're going to see two versions of it now and how those two versions interact with a statement of Rabbi Yochanan. And then we're going to note that this Baraita is going to contradict the Mishnah, and that's why we're going to actually have to change the authorship. Okay, so let's see how this works. Amar Rabba bar bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Zo divrei Rabbi Akiva setim ta'a. This is that which we just read in the Mishnah, that there are multiple days. That follows only the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Even though the Mishnah just quoted it as anonymous, Rabbi Akiva we call the anonymous one. Why is Rabbi Akiva the anonymous one? Well, first, for example, here and other places, Rabbi Akiva is really the one that started the gathering project of Torah Shebe'al Peh, gathering together everything that would eventually make it in the Mishnah. And furthermore, we know that just like Stam Mishnah is Kirbi Meir, the Stam Sifra and Sifre and Tosefta are all follow the students of the various students of Rabbi Akiva. And so therefore, Rabbi Akiva is the father of all the anonymous opinions. So that's why we give him the nickname, the anonymous one. He's so powerful that he's not often not even quoted because his influence is everywhere. And so the Darish Zemanehim. So our Mishnah is actually only the opinion of Rabbi Akiva that uses that Rashav Zemanehim to say that you can read Megilah on multiple days. Aval Chachamim Omrim and Korin Ota Ela Bizmana. However, the sages disagreed and said only at its time, meaning that's it, only on the 14th and 15th. I mean, the Torah says that in the Megilah, but that's it, not on the 11th, 12th, and 13th. That's the sages disagree with the Mishnah. Okay, this is a very important opinion, basically disagreeing with everything that we've said so far. Now we have a challenge to the statement of Rabbi Yochanan, right? Is this really true that the sages would say this and the Mishnah is only Rabbi Akiva metibe? Amar Rabbi Yehuda, who was actually a student of Rabbi Akiva, Ematai bizman shashanim ketiknan v'isel shurim al admatam. When do we read on multiple days? Only when we are in the land and we are established and settled. Aval bazman hazeh. However, nowadays, after the Bet HaMikdash is destroyed and we are no longer settled in our land, since we all rely on the date of Purim, we look at the date of Purim to know when Pesach is going to be. We say, "Oh, Purim is this day. Okay, we'll add 30 days, and then we know when Pesach is." Therefore, we only read it at the right time. We have to only read it on the 14th so that we will correctly calculate Pesach. And in the times back in the Bet HaMikdash, so since they're all settled, they have forms of communication and everyone can tell each other. And so even the villages who did it on a different day, they would all be coordinated. But it's too hard to coordinate when we are no longer on our land. Okay, so that's a statement of Rabbi Yehuda. That's what he says. Now, who is Rabbi Yehuda following? Rabbi Yehuda, Adi Bademan, Ilem Ali Bad Rabbi Akiva, Afilu Bazman Hazeh, Ita Lahaita Kanta. If he's explaining this according to Rabbi Akiva, then even nowadays, this takana should apply that we all read on the 14th and we don't go to different days. But that's impossible because Rabbi Akiva lived after the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash. And yet he said, we should follow different days. So Rabbi Akiva couldn't possibly be saying that Rabbi Yehuda couldn't possibly be saying that Rabbi Akiva would agree with this. Rabbi Akiva made no such distinction. So therefore, what's the other possibility? Rabbi Yehuda is explaining it according to Rabbanan. And according to that, when we are in the land, we would read on different days. But that's not what Rabbi Yochanan here said. Rabbi Yochanan says that Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Akiva, disagree with them fundamentally all the time. And he doesn't make a distinction between one time and another in Rabbi Yochanan's statement. And so therefore, this would be a challenge here. Tiyubta, the Rabbi Yochanan, Tiyubta, this would be a challenge to Rabbi Yochanan, who is an Amorah, and this is a Baraita, and so therefore, what Rabbi Yochanan's distinction between Hachamim, Rabbi Akiva, this is only the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, cannot possibly be. And Rabbi Yochanan is refuted. However, don't worry, we have another version of this whole discussion, which is shorter and in which everything makes sense. Ika de amre amar Rabba bar Chana amar Rabbi Yochanan. So the same statement that we started with says Zo divrei Rabbi Akiva sitim ta'a. Yeah, the Mishnah follows Rabbi Akiva. Aval chachamim amru, and here we have something new. Bizman hazeh ho'il mistakelin ba en korinota ela bizmana. Here, chachamim don't fundamentally disagree with Rabbi Akiva altogether. They just say nowadays we disagree, right? Because since nowadays everybody is looking to Purim to calculate the calendar for Pesach, we only read it on its own day. But they would agree that back in the day of the Bet HaMikdash, yes, then we would follow Rabbi Akiva. Oh, once you understand it this way, now everything comes together. Tanya Namehachi, the Baraita fits with this. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, when do we follow the Mishnah that there are different days? That's only when we are on the land in Bet HaMikdash times. But nowadays, since we rely on it, so we all do it only on the 14th, and that's Chachamim. Rabbi Akiva would disagree and say, no, we can still do it on different days. Okay, good. So this makes a lot more sense, which would maybe suggest that the first version is the original, because it makes sense that one would take the first version and make it make more sense rather than the other way around. But anyway, this Baraita was transmitted, and the statement of Rabbi Akiva was transmitted in two different ways, and the second one fits with the Baraita. Okay, now Rav Asher kashya le'ed Rabbi Yehuda ad Rabbi Yehuda. Now Rabbi Yehuda himself contradicts something he's going to say in a next Mishnah, and he's going to answer it. We'll see what the next Mishnah says. But Rav Asher answered it and said, "Mokim la Baraita ki Rabbi Yoseh bar Yehuda," and he's going to answer it by saying that this Baraita we've been discussing the whole time is actually not by Rabbi Yehuda, but the son Rabbi Yoseh bar Yehuda. Okay, so what's the Mishnah that he brought to contradict? Did Rabbi Yehuda really say that we should only read it on the 14th? He said the only time you could read the Megilah on the 11th is in a village there where they only gather on Monday and Thursday. But if it's a village where they don't gather on Monday and Thursday, then they have to read it on the 14th. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. Now, implied in this Mishnah is that there are villages that read it on a different day. Place that they do gather, they would read it on a different day. And that sounds like even nowadays he's describing, and not only in the times of the Bet HaMikdash. And yet the Baraita that we talked about before sounded like we only read it on the 14th itself nowadays. So how do we resolve it? That Baraita is actually not Rabbi Yehuda. It's Rabbi Yoseh bar Yehuda. All right, good. Well, that's convenient. You just change the name, and that's the next Gemara's next surprise. Umishum de kashya le Rabbi Yehuda mokim la Baraita ki Rabbi Yoseh bar Yehuda. So just because you have a question, now you could just go and change the name. Is that a way to resolve a contradiction? It's an easy way, but it's is that authentic? The answer is that Rav Asher actually heard two traditions. Some of the memorizers said this Baraita in the name of Rabbi Yehuda. Some of the memorizers repeated it in the name of Rabbi Yoseh bar Yehuda. So he didn't know which one it is. Amad, and since he found a contradiction between that Baraita and the Mishnah, Amad, man detane la Rabbi Yehuda lav davka, man detane la Rabbi Yoseh bar Yehuda davka. So he actually could use the statement in the Mishnah to help him figure out the correct authorship. And the one who said that is Rabbi Yehuda is not precise in his retelling, and the one who says it's Rabbi Yoseh bar Yehuda is precise. All right, good. So we figured out those. And now the next question is, what's the source that walled cities would read on the 15th of Adar? Yoshua bin Nun Korin b'chamisha asar mina hanemile. What is the source of this? Amarava damar kera al ken haYehudim haperazim hayoshebim ba'areh haperazot. So we learn it from an inference. Since this pasuk says the Jews who are scattered, perazim literally means scattered, who are living in the scattered cities. Scattered city means a city that doesn't have a wall on it. It's a sprawling city. And it says they should read on the 14th. So we infer that only they read on the 14th. Someone who has a wall will read on the 15th. Okay, that's a good derivation. Now, ve'ema perazim ba'arba'asar mukafin kelal kalal la. Why don't I say that? I agree that those in unwalled cities have to read in the 14th, but maybe those in a walled city don't read at all. How do you know? It doesn't say explicitly that they would read on the 15th. Maybe they don't read at all. Wait, that can't be. Aren't they Jews? It says from Ahashverosh's reign, was the whole world from Hodu till Kush, and these Jews lived under there, and they were threatened, and they celebrated. So they must have celebrated sometime. So that can't be. Well, okay, then maybe in unwalled cities on the 14th, in walled cities, maybe they should celebrate 2 days, the 14th and the 15th. After all, Pasuk says, "Kedichtiv yotosim et yom 14 lechodesh Adar ve'et yom 15 bo bechol shana," to celebrate both of these days. Is actually a very reasonable thing to say because, right, if you read it very literally, it does say you make both of these days a holiday. And in fact, the Karaites celebrate it in this way on the 14th and the 15th. So we answer, now, if it didn't have the word et and it said to celebrate the 14th and 15th, then I would agree. Then walled cities celebrate 2 days. So now the word et, the accusative particle, is separating between the 14th and 15th, saying, no, just one or the other. And since it's the ones in the unwalled cities are on the 14th, that leaves the 15th for those in the walled cities. Good. I want to say that the unwalled cities have to do on the 14th. The one in the walled cities can choose either one they want, 14 or 15. No, that can't be. Since it says in their designated times, each person, each place has its own designated time, and they can't overlap or share. Now, ve'ema bitlesar keshushan. So then why don't they say in the that walled cities would be on the 13th? So make it different from the 14th. No, that doesn't make sense. They should do it like Shushan, right? Since Shushan for sure is doing it on the 15th, it makes sense that the walled cities would be on the 15th also. Okay. And finally, Ashkechan Asiya Zechira Minelan. All of these pisukim we were talking about are the asiyah, are the actual doing, the observing, the celebration of the holiday, which would include a festive meal and giving gifts and all that. But the reading Megilah is merely a mentioning of the story. So how do I know that everything we said here applies to the mentioning? So this is very important. This shows that they see the reading of the Megilah not as an essential part of the celebration, but rather a remembering of the story so that we will then be in the mood to celebrate. So that's what I was hinting to before, that this is why it could be that we read the Megilah even a couple of days before the celebration, because, okay, I know this is not the holiday, but it's okay. You learned about the holiday beforehand. So now we're asking, how do we know that the mentioning should be at the same time as the celebration? Because we are trying to make it the same time and not just any time before. Because another pasuk says they are remembered and practiced. Therefore, the remembrance and the observance are back to back, and they should be, if possible, on the same day. Okay, very good. And now we get to the last topic, which is there is another opinion altogether that when we talk about walled cities that they celebrate on the 15th, it's not a walled city from the time of Yehoshua, but rather a walled city, any city that was walled at the time of Ahashverosh, which actually does make some sense because that's when the holiday was established. So if you want to do a place like Shushan, it would be a place that has had a wall at the same time. Okay, so matnitin de la ki haytana de Tanya. Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha Omer, Kirachina mukafin choma mimot Ahashverosh, korin v'chamisha asar. This is a Tosefta that says, according to Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha, any city that had a wall from the time of Ahashverosh during the Persian period, that they read on the 15th. And it doesn't matter what their status was beforehand, way in the time of Yoshua. Okay, so now question. My Ta'amad Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha. Ironically, that Rabbi Yoshua is the one who doesn't take the time of Rabbi Yehoshua, but rather of Ahashverosh. So what's his reason? Ki Shushan, ma Shushan mukafet choma mimot Ahashverosh ukorin b'chamisha asar. Af kol shemukafet choma mimot Ahashverosh korin b'chamisha asar. Just like Shushan has a wall from the time of Ahashverosh, and they read on the 15th. So any city that has a wall during the time of Ahashverosh also reads on the 15th. And our Mishnah, which said from the time any walled city that had any city that had a wall in the time of Yehoshua bin Nun, even if it didn't have a wall during the time of Ahashverosh, like Yerushalayim, which did not have a wall, only after that story, Nehemiah goes and builds a wall for Yerushalayim. So what's his source? And we go from the time of Yehoshua. Yalef perazi ketivacha al ken hayudim perazim וכתיבתם לבד מערי הפרזי הרבה מאוד. מה להלן מוקפת חומה ממות יהושע בן נון? אף כאן מוקפת חומה ממות יהושע בן נון. We're going to use a גזרה שווה, since it talks about the Jews, the scattered Jews, meaning those in an unwalled city. And now we're comparing this pasuk in Esther to a pasuk in Devarim, where Moshe is telling Yehoshua, right? We are conquering those lands of the Perazi, the unwalled cities, that there are a great many of them, both the ones that Moshe already conquered on the other side of the Jordan, and encouraging Yehoshua that when he goes in the land, he also will conquer them. And so, since it says the word Perazi there regarding the walled cities during the time of Yehoshua ben Nun, so too when it says here we should celebrate the days in the unwalled cities, and that implies also in the walled cities. It means the walled cities that had a wall from the time of Yehoshua ben Nun. Okay. Incidentally, all of these derashot are really fascinating because we're talking about making a derasha from Megillat Esther. Usually, we only make this kind of derasha, right? An extra word, an extra plural, a gezerah shava within the Torah. Only the Torah can be used for legal derivation. The times when we use a pasuk from Nevi'im and Ketuvim are pretty rare, and even there, it's usually that I know the Torah says Shabbat. Where else can I derive some way that the Nevi'im might shed some light on how to keep Shabbat? And they'll talk about carrying and something like that. But here we're treating the Pisukim in Esther as if they were Pisukim from the Torah, which is very curious. A suggestion why they do that is perhaps because we know that Purim was in a lot of doubt, and many people didn't want to celebrate Purim, adding a new holiday. Who are you? Who has the authority to go and add another holiday, and even to add another book of Tanakh? So maybe these kind of derashot of entreating Megillat Esther in a way that we make derashot on its words are a way of raising the authenticity, authority of the Megillah, and thereby encouraging the celebration of Purim. Okay, just a thought. Now, Bishlam Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha lo amar ketana didan dedet le perazi. We understand why Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha says only from the time of Ahashverosh walled cities. He would not agree with our Mishnah because he doesn't say that you can make this gezerah shava, right? Gezerah shava, you have to have a tradition of a gezerah shava from Har Sinai, and Megillat Esther wasn't even there, and wasn't even written during Har Sinai, so he could reject that. But our Tana that says from the time of Yehoshua ben Nun, why doesn't he agree with Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha? And we answer, we say, what are you talking about? My tama. Why are you asking that question? He said, why? He said he has a gezerah shava. No hachi kamar ela shushan de'avda keman lo kifrazim velo kimukafin. No, rather, this is what he meant to ask. That is his question is that Shushan doesn't. Who are they? Who is Shushan doing anything like? Since Shushan is not celebrating in like the unwalled towns, because those would be on the 15th, and not like the walled cities, because the residents of Shushan celebrate on the 15th, but the city was not surrounded by a wall in time of Yoshua bin Nun. So according to our Tanah, right? Why? How could you explain this? That Shushan itself doesn't fit into the category of those days that you would celebrate on the 15th, because you only celebrate on the 15th in a city that has a wall from your time of Yoshua bin Nun, and Shushan, according to this, did not. And so that's his question. Amar Ravav, Amri la kedi, shane Shushan, ho'il v'nasa banes. And so either Rava said, or some say it in an unattributed way, no, Shushan is different from all the others because that's where the very miracle happened. So for sure, Shushan, we're going to celebrate on the 15th. But in addition, but that's an exception. Otherwise, only if it has a wall from the time of Yoshua bin Nun. And this is a way of kind of flipping the importance that, in the Megilah itself, it sounds like Shushan is so important. We have an extra day there. Here it's saying only a city that had a wall from the time of Yoshua, Yerushalayim. That's the main celebration where we're going to add another day. And you know what? All right, we'll allow one exception, that Shushan also we will celebrate. Okay, good. And to conclude, one last explanation of a pasuk. According to our Mishnah, that says from the time of Yoshua bin Nun, that's why the pasuk makes a lot of distinctions and says in every single province and every single city, Medina lehalek ben mukafin choma mimot Yoshua bin Nun mukafet choma mimot Ahashverosh. We need the words every Medina to say both those provinces that have a wall from the time of Yoshua bin Nun and Shushan that has a wall from to separate between those wall cities that have a wall from the time of Yoshua bin Nun, which do celebrate the 15th, versus those that didn't and only have a wall from the time of Ahashverosh, and they would not celebrate on the 15th except for Shushan. And then and I also need the words Ir va'ir to separate between between Shushan and other places. So I need two distinctions, right? There's all other cities that are on the 14th. There's the walled cities from the time of Yoshua bin Nun, and there's also Shushan. So that it all makes sense why I need these two phrases of distinction. According to Yoshua ben Korcha, only one distinction. I only have to distinguish between Shushan and cities that have a wall from the time of Ahashverosh, like Shushan, versus other cities that didn't have a wall then. And so that's implied in Medina. Why do I need another distinction between every single city? Because he doesn't have to distinguish between the time of Yoshua bin Nun and time of Ahashverosh. Amar lach Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha. Yoshua ben Korcha says, I have an answer. And even according to our Mishnah, can he actually make sense of this pasuk? Since our Tanah agrees with the Gezerah Shava, Perazi, and he learns that from there that from the time of Yoshua bin Nun, so already has that distinction, Yoshua bin Nun versus all other places. So therefore, Medina Lamali. So Medina is extra, even according to him. The words Medina are unnecessary according to both of us. So I'll give you an answer that will solve the problem for everyone. We need these words Medina for a different derivation. Yoshua ben Levi. Yoshua ben Levi. When we talk about a city, it's not a walled city. It's not only those within the wall, even those on the outskirts of the wall that are near it have the same law, and they would also read on the 15th like those in the city. And the question is, Ad Kama, how far from that wall would they still be included? Meal, it would be the distance if you were walking from Chamtan here to Tiberias. And that is 1 mil, Roman mile, which is about the same as a kilometer. So a kilometer all around the walled city has the same law and also reads on the 15th, which is actually very relevant for Jerusalem today, which they'll have the old city and then the new city goes on for a long, long time. And so what would be included in Jerusalem today that would read on the 15th? So we'd have to explain how we apply this. Okay, velema meal. So why not just say meal? Why do you have to say it in this way? Ha kamashmalan de shiura de meal kamahave mechamatan de Tiberia. No, wants to add something else, and maybe you don't know what a meal is, so that's why he said it in this way. It's like a walk from Chamatan to Tiberia, and that is a meal, and that way we know that how big a meal is. And we can go now and go walk it, and then we can calculate the precise amount of what is a meal. And so we saw, to summarize, that there are 5 different days on which the Megilah is read. We saw 2 different ways of deriving it from Pesukim and why they disagree with each other. So Baraita of Yehuda that says nowadays we only read it on the 14th, and that is in fact what we do today, 14th or 15th. We saw a source that the walled cities would be on Adar 15th, even though it's not explicit in the Pesukim that for all generations some would read on the 15th. And then we saw the difference between our Mishnah, which says from the time of Rabbi Yoshua ben Nun versus Rabbi Yoshua ben Kocha that says walled cities from the time of Ahashverosh. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.